This morning, an internal diplomatic cable from the Canadian Department of Finance landed on desks across London and Brussels, revealing a sequence of macroeconomic calculations that fundamentally reprices the risk of global trade. Yesterday, Prime Minister Mark Carney stood before a briefing room in Ottawa and delivered a single-word response to the United States that effectively ended 8 decades of uncontested American economic hegemony. That action was not a standard diplomatic counter-proposal, but a precise structural refusal that took less than 12 minutes to dismantle the core assumption of asymmetric trade leverage. To understand why this moment represents an unprecedented departure from the established international order, one must examine the timeline of the preceding 72 hours. On June 19, 2026, the White House issued a strict 30-day ultimatum demanding that Canada eliminate all retaliatory tariffs, grant Washington direct oversight over its critical mineral exports, and accept a dispute resolution mechanism where the United States would function as both defendant and judge. The document carried the implicit threat of full-spectrum tariffs and the invocation of emergency economic powers, a framework that historically forced immediate compliance. Internal modeling by Canada's Finance Ministry analyzed 14 distinct economic scenarios under these pressures, 11 of which explicitly projected a domestic recession within 2 quarters if Ottawa chose defiance. Every historical precedent and data model suggested compliance was the only rational choice for an economy 1/10 the size of its neighbor. That context is what makes Carney's ultimate refusal a calculated pivot rather than a political gamble, when the Canadian Prime Minister stated that Canada does not accept ultimatums and described the country's economic diversification as permanent and irrevocable. That detail tells you he was shifting the dispute from a temporary political negotiation to a binding structural reality. In contract law, the term irrevocable signifies a commitment designed to outlast governments, terms, and shifting public sentiment. By using that specific vocabulary, Carney signaled to global markets that Canada had already legally and contractually redirected its economic dependencies. When the official rejection was logged in Washington at 2:47 p.m. Eastern Time, the immediate reaction revealed a profound miscalculation. The White House press office received 46 urgent media inquiries within 15 minutes. Yet the administration could only produce a single-sentence statement nearly 2 hours later, noting that it was reviewing the remarks. That sequence is not coincidental. It is a direct policy statement. The traditional White House model predicted that an asymmetric threat would instantly depress the Canadian dollar, trigger intense domestic corporate lobbying against the government, and force Ottawa to capitulate under market pressure. Instead, within the first 24 hours, the Canadian dollar remained entirely stable without any central bank intervention. The market calculated that a nation executing a long-term diversification strategy based on structural analysis was a lower risk than an economy relying on unenforceable ultimatums. This calculus was validated when 2 international credit rating agencies issued formal statements affirming Canada's sovereign rating with a stable outlook, explicitly citing policy clarity. That detail tells you that the international financial community now views decoupling from unpredictable trade structures as a stabilizing factor rather than a systemic risk. The subsequent 48 hours triggered an international cascade that moved directly against Washington's strategic interests. The European Union immediately issued a statement defending sovereign trade rights, while Japan accelerated 2 bilateral trade pacts with Ottawa that had languished in negotiations for over 14 months. South Korea, Australia, and the United Kingdom followed with similar diplomatic alignments within 48 hours, establishing an uncoordinated but highly effective defensive front. This response bypassed traditional alliance frameworks, operating instead on the basis of independent national self-interest. What that alignment reveals is that the demonstration effect of a successful refusal instantly alters the strategic options available to every mid-sized economy on Earth. This shift became clear in the final 24 hours of the crisis, when 4 independent nations quietly paused their own separate trade compliance negotiations with the United States. Those four paused negotiations represent more than $200 billion in combined bilateral trade volume with the American market. In geopolitical terms, a paused negotiation is vastly more problematic than a canceled one, because it indicates that terms previously deemed non-negotiable are now subject to active reevaluation. Washington's strategic planners modeled Canada in absolute isolation, factoring in currency shifts and direct tariff impacts, but they failed to model the secondary consequences of a public refusal surviving market scrutiny. Once the premium for compliance is shown to be artificially inflated, the perceived risk of economic defiance is fundamentally repriced across the globe. Three distinct structural forces ensure that this international realignment remains permanent regardless of future political developments. The first is the credibility ratchet, which dictates that an economic ultimatum is a depreciating asset. Its success reinforces future leverage, while its public failure permanently devalues subsequent threats. The next time Washington attempts to enforce compliance via market access, the target nation will systematically reference the Canadian precedent of June 2026. The second force is the coalition effect, which permanently alters the math of bilateral intimidation by distributing retaliation risks and diluting the direct costs of defiance among a broader group of trading partners. The third and most decisive force is infrastructure lock-in, because the shipping corridors, Arctic trade routes, and Pacific port expansions currently under construction involve physical assets and long-term contracts that cannot be reversed by a political transition or a single telephone call. Physical infrastructure creates fixed switching costs so high that the new diversified arrangement becomes the permanent arrangement by default, rendering the shift irreversible. But the unresolved tension, the one that corporate boards and central banks from Tokyo to Frankfurt are analyzing with intense scrutiny tonight, centers on the immediate domestic structural paradox now facing the White House. If the administration enforces its threatened sanctions, it will inflict equivalent macroeconomic damage on American supply chains and industrial sectors. Yet if it chooses to negotiate, it publicly concedes that its final ultimatums are fundamentally unenforceable. The mechanism that sustained American trade dominance for 80 years relied entirely on compliance being mandatory. But now that defiance has been proven survivable, compliance becomes a voluntary policy choice. The strategic math has shifted permanently, leaving global markets to figure out exactly how the world's largest economy intends to project power when its primary tool of economic coercion no longer commands automatic obedience. The immediate tension of this confrontation hinges on a structural paradox that Washington completely failed to model: the weaponization of an alternative economic network. While the White House expected an isolated neighbor to capitulate under the threat of full-spectrum tariffs, the response from Ottawa revealed that the cost of American defiance had already been heavily offset by a network of pre-existing, legally binding global pacts. The strategic theater has now shifted from a standard bilateral trade dispute to a highly calculated deployment of diversification assets that Canada spent months quietly assembling. The foundation of this strategy became visible on January 16, 2026, when Ottawa unexpectedly finalized a comprehensive agreement in principle with China to normalize and expand trade relations following several years of frozen diplomatic ties. That sequence is not coincidental. It is a direct policy statement. By restoring access to the world's largest consumer market for agricultural and industrial goods months before the American ultimatum was even drafted, Canada systematically removed its vulnerability to single market coercion. What that timing reveals is a deliberate, proactive choice to insulate the domestic economy from predictable trade shocks, demonstrating that the technocratic leadership in Ottawa was already operating on the assumption that the traditional rules-based order had ended. International Bar Association. This calculated pivot was reinforced 4 days later during a special address at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where the Canadian leadership laid out the macroeconomic doctrine that would ultimately guide its defiance. Hegemons cannot continually monetize their relationships, the Prime Minister stated during the address. explicitly warning that automatic compliance with great power coercion would no longer guarantee national safety. What that response reveals is a deliberate choice to reject transactional diplomacy in favor of strategic autonomy. The statement served notice to global capital markets that Canada was actively transitioning its economic model away from asymmetric dependencies, transforming a rhetorical commitment to sovereignty into an explicit corporate policy. The World Economic Forum, the operational reality behind this doctrine, is driven by a massive reallocation of capital designed to physically anchor Canada's new trade routes. Internal records from the Privy Council office show that the government has fast-tracked a targeted $1 trillion investment portfolio specifically dedicated to critical minerals, artificial intelligence, clean energy, and alternative Pacific and Arctic trade corridors. That detail tells you that the diversification strategy is not a diplomatic bluff, but an engineered structural shift backed by concrete, steel, and fiber optic infrastructure. These physical assets create immense switching costs that effectively bind future administrations to the new trade alignment, making a post-crisis return to exclusive American supply chains economically unfeasible. The World Economic Forum on June 12, 2026, just 1 week before the White House issued its 30-day ultimatum, Canada executed a major strategic maneuver in Europe by signing a sweeping general security of information agreement with France. That timeline is critical to understanding the depth of the plan. This agreement went far beyond basic intelligence sharing. It's establishing a comprehensive framework for direct defense industrial cooperation and advanced aerospace procurement. What that framework does structurally is redirect the gravity of Canadian defense spending away from American defense giants and integrate it directly into European manufacturing networks. The timing of this signature indicates that Ottawa had systematically secured its strategic flanks before delivering its public refusal to Washington. www.pm.she.ca. This defense reorientation was paired with a massive financial commitment to secondary security theaters, creating a diplomatic shield that made it nearly impossible for Washington to isolate Canada internationally. During the G7 Leaders Summit in Evian on June 16, 2026, Ottawa announced an immediate $2.8 billion military assistance package for Ukraine, alongside a proposal for a new specialized defense, security, and resilience bank. That specific allocation represents a deliberate effort to position Canada as an indispensable provider of global security architecture. By embedding its financial resources deeply into the defense priorities of the European Union and NATO allies, Canada effectively raised the geopolitical cost of any subsequent American retaliation, ensuring that an attack on Canadian commerce would be viewed in Brussels as a direct threat to continental security. The legal mechanism used by the White House to enforce its trade demands further exposed the structural limits of American leverage. Following a Supreme Court ruling that restricted the unilateral use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the administration was forced to rely on Section 122 of the 1974 Trade Act to implement a 15% global tariff. That shift in legal authority is highly consequential. Section 122 contains strict statutory limitations regarding scope and duration, rendering a permanent targeted economic blockade against a specific ally legally vulnerable inside the United States. This regulatory detail tells you that the White House was operating with a diminished legal toolkit, an exposure that a former central banker like Carney could exploit with absolute technical precision. International Bar Association, the immediate commercial response to the standoff, confirmed that transnational corporations had already anticipated the shift and were adjusting their supply chains accordingly. Within 48 hours of the Ottawa press conference, German technology firm RCT Solutions finalized a massive joint venture with Canada's Silica to build a fully integrated, high-purity solar manufacturing hub in Manitoba. That transaction represents a direct rejection of the American market access threat. Private international capital is actively choosing to fund Canadian industrial capacity because the country offers policy consistency and raw material sovereignty. What this investment flow implies is that the global tech sector views Canada's critical mineral reserves as a safer long-term bet when insulated from Washington's regulatory volatility. .pm.cc.ca. Show one, but the single unresolved question, the one that sovereign wealth funds and maritime logistics conglomerates are tracking with intense analytical scrutiny, centers on the upcoming August review of the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement. If the automated compliance mechanisms within that treaty are formally suspended by Washington, it will instantly trigger a chaotic legal unwinding of North American manufacturing that neither economy is structurally prepared to absorb. The ultimate outcome of this geopolitical tilt will not be decided by political rhetoric, but by whether the cross-border corporate supply chains that handle over $2 billion in daily trade can survive the transition to a fractured continental market. Synthesizing this network of defense alignments, sovereign credit adjustments, and multi-billion-dollar industrial reshoring projects reveals a far larger pattern than a standard cross-border trade dispute. The strategic maneuvers executed by Ottawa throughout 2026 demonstrate that Canada was not merely reacting to an isolated threat, but was deploying a thoroughly insulated, multi-regional policy architecture designed specifically to survive a confrontation with the world's largest market. This methodical preparation completely inverted the traditional math of bilateral economic coercion. The immediate implications of this strategic shift alter the policy calculus for every major global actor. For Canada, the successful refusal permanently cements its position as an autonomous middle power capable of enforcing its own resource sovereignty and setting the terms of its own economic integration. For the United States, the loss of an uncontested compliance mechanism signifies that market size alone is no longer an absolute geopolitical weapon, forcing Washington to transition from a strategy of commercial coercion to one of baseline market competitiveness. Across Europe, the open support for Ottawa has effectively normalized the concept of strategic decoupling, allowing continental capitals to accelerate their own supply chain security initiatives without initiating an open diplomatic rupture with Washington. Meanwhile, for emerging economic giants like India, the emergence of a viable middle-power defensive front provides a clear, tested playbook for resisting external regulatory ultimatums while maintaining uninterrupted access to global trade networks. The likely next moves will focus heavily on how these distributed trade and defense networks institutionalize their new alignment as the August review of the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement approaches. Global trade balances will depend on whether cross-border corporate coalitions can force a regulatory pause before manufacturing integrated supply chains are permanently dismantled. Simultaneously, the deployment of Canada's trillion-dollar diversification portfolio into alternative Arctic and Pacific trade corridors will continue to physically lock in these new commercial vectors, turning temporary diplomatic defense mechanisms into permanent, structural routes that operate entirely outside of North American market dominance. Ultimately, the single most critical takeaway from this 72-hour crisis transcends the specific bilateral relationship between Ottawa and Washington. The true structural lesson is that the global economic architecture has transitioned from a system of unipolar leverage to a highly complex landscape of distributed resilience, where mid-sized economies can successfully withstand great power ultimatums by embedding themselves within legally binding, highly diversified international partnerships. When a nation representing only a fraction of its neighbor's economic size successfully demonstrates that commercial defiance is a survivable, market-affirmed option, the fundamental assumption that compliance is mandatory is permanently shattered. The old era of absolute commercial dominance did not collapse because of a sudden market panic, but because an ally systematically proved that the cost of surrender was vastly higher than the cost of independence.